Afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. This is to talk about the recent addition in terms of the COVID support payment scheme. And first of all, I'd like to introduce you all to Keith Taylor. So afternoon, Keith. Just to clarify, you're the operational lead for the COVID-19 support payment.
Yeah, that's right. Hello, everybody. Welcome along.
So just to go through this, obviously, the scheme opened yesterday after an announcement last week by Grant Robertson, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister. And as we see it, this scheme's aimed at helping businesses particularly hit by the Omicron wave that's about to go through. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today and explaining to people how it works, who qualifies for it, and how they qualify for it. So what we want to cover is who's eligible and try and answer any of the questions that will come from our members and from the wider business community so they understand just how the scheme works. So looking at this, the expectation is that this will help a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises. And I think the government estimates that it will cover 60 to 70% of outgoings. What are the kind of reactions you've had from businesses so far, Keith?
Oh, well, the good news is in the just over 24 hours the schemes have been open, 30,000 businesses have applied. Of those, 24,000 have received payments totaling 117.5 million as at 1 o'clock today. Lot of businesses applying and money is starting to go out to them. Round about on average $4,800 per application. So that indicates to me that is relatively small businesses, particularly possibly sole traders and contractors. And if it's not them, it's ones who've just got one or two employees. So not particularly big business at the moment. That's not unsurprising because sometimes large businesses do just need to take a bit of time to pull the information together, particularly about their employees and so on, before they go in and make their application.
And so when you look at those 30,000 who've applied, how does that compare to the previous payments in terms of the resurgence payments at the same point in time?
Sure. So for the first resurgence payment back in August last year, which was the first big one, there were ones previous to that which were a bit smaller. We had 58,000 applications on the first day for that one. So this one is being targeted or being focused more in on perhaps a different group of businesses who are being impacted quite differently to those businesses back in August. I guess you could almost compare it to what we saw for the transition payment. We saw around about 26,000 applications on day one of that. So they seem to be in the similar kind of ballpark.
And the vast majority of people who are applying are eligible and are managing to get through the process okay?
Yeah, so based on the information they provided in their application and the declarations that they agreed to, yep, it appears they are eligible. I mean, many of these businesses would have got RSP before. We may well have reviewed their RSP application, and we'd made some decisions based on their RSP. There's no reason to think why that necessarily would have changed if the businesses now experience another revenue drop because of Omicron, largely.
Okay, and so to look at the specifics of the eligibility, because there's been a wee bit of confusion around this because Grant Robertson announced one thing which was reported, and as I understand it, that was the wrong way around, and now that's been clarified, which is great. But just to cover off the basics, what are the basics that before somebody sits down on the IRD website, what are the basics that they've got to cover first of all?
Okay, so there has to have been a 40% or more revenue drop. That's probably the first thing to consider. If you haven't achieved that, then there's probably no point in even thinking more about the payment because this is not for that business. So the 40% revenue drop, and I think this is where the confusion came in between what the minister said and did in a press release versus what has now been published. There is confusion. So what a business needs to do is look at a typical 7 days in the 6 weeks between the 5th of January 2022 and the 15th of February 2022. Sorry. That is what we call the comparison period. So that's what you're looking back to. What is a typical 7 days of revenue for your business during that 6 weeks period? Then you compare that revenue to a 7-day period that starts after the 15th of February. So it could be the 16th of February for 7 days. It could be the 20th of February for 7 days. You look at your revenue for that 7-day period. If that revenue has dropped by more than 40%, the business may be eligible for CSP. So it's probably the first test to go through. You
Okay.
probably have a gut feel for that, if you were doing reasonably well or okay back in January, February, and you are now not doing okay, then that's the first test. The next thing is you need to show the cause of the revenue drop is because of what's happening right now.
Right.
And we talk about that on the website as a public health measure or a COVID-19 circumstance, which is horribly bureaucratic, unfortunately. What we mean by that is, is your business impacted to such a degree because your staff are having to self-isolate? Then that is what we would call, as a result of a public health measure or a COVID circumstance, your revenue's been impacted. Because if you haven't got staff, say if you're somebody who does urgent electrical repairs, I think we use this as an example on our website. If you have 10 staff and 6 of them can't go and do work because either they're close contacts or they have tested positive, then your revenue is going to take a hit because you can't go out and do those on-call repairs. So that is what we mean by a circumstance surrounding what's happening now.
Okay. So,
yeah.
Sorry, carry on.
No, you go. Yeah.
So just one of the things that I'm unsure about, and I think some businesses are, what's the end date? So in terms of the period, the 16th of Feb, does that go through to yesterday because that's when the scheme opened, or could it go through to next week?
So an end date hasn't been set yet.
Right.
That is expected to be set probably next week as part of the legislative process. A couple of things will be happening next week, which perhaps I'll explain because there are legislative processes around some of this. One is we expect the affected revenue periods for all 3 payments to be finalised. So it will give an end date to your first payment. It will set the dates for the second payment, and it will set the dates for the third payment as to where you compare your revenue to.
Because based on the previous, particularly the resurgence support payments, there was a date by which if you hadn't made the claim, you missed out on that payment?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess 2 things going on. One, the affected revenue period end date needs to be set.
Yeah.
I'm expecting, actually, I don't know what to expect quite. It probably might be late March, for example, for the first payment. Then applications will remain open for a period of time after that.
Okay.
Typically, that's another 4 weeks after the affected revenue period end date. So it gets all a little bit messy or confusing when you've got multiple payments available. So it's not like the wage subsidy where you had to be in within that 2 weeks to apply and then it was gone.
Right.
So very different for CSP.
There's a bit more freedom, in fact, not freedom, but there's a bit more largesse here, and people just need to get their brain around it first of all. So just to go back,
that comes back to the point is, unless you're desperate for money, you don't have to rush in and do this. If you need to take your time to consider what your position is and what's the cause of what's happening to you, what is my revenue loss, take the time to do that. And there's plenty of time to apply.
And you won't necessarily miss out. So it's not as though the starting gun's been fired and you've got to crack on. You can actually take a bit of time. So one of the other bits I just wanted to cover, I think, is we've talked about the 40% decline, and we'll go on to the other criteria in terms of how that might be measured in terms of that comparable period. But there's also some basics that you've got to do. So you've got to be in business for a month. You've got to be based in New Zealand. What are the other ones around there?
You've got to be over 18 because you've got to sign a contract. Eligibility criteria. You have to, if you're a regulated business, comply with the vaccine certificate requirements. So this is very different to what RSP was. I'll use a couple of, and another one here, and I can tie some examples together, is you've got to take all practical, reasonable steps to minimize the revenue drop. So these are quite different to what RSP was, because there were no vaccine certificates around at the time when RSPs were operating. So let's take an example. We have a restaurant. They usually would have seating capacity for 200 people, typically. So it's a fairly big restaurant. Under the current settings, they have, if they want to have dine-in, They have to limit, I think, to 100 people. I think that's
Yep,
still correct.
that's correct.
They have to have everybody seated. They have to probably have their staff wearing masks, and they have to operate vaccine passes. Probably some other stuff as well, but that's probably
And
paints
table
enough.
service and a couple of other
Yeah,
things.
tables, yeah, separation and one server and all those requirements. So there's a set of rules that a business, if they are going to choose to operate as seated, in-house service, they have to work that out. Now, by doing that, and they agree that's what I'm going to do to keep my business going, the likelihood is they're going to suffer a revenue drop.
Yep.
Because I can't have 200 people possibly rotating quite quickly through my restaurant anymore. I can only have 100, and because they're seated, they might be staying longer, and it all just takes a bit longer to do things. So there's going to be a revenue drop likely. If you can then tie that revenue drop to having to comply with these requirements, then also then if staff are sick or your customers are still not turning up, then you've met some eligibility criteria.
Yep. That
You've
makes
complied
sense.
with what you had to do under the vaccine certificate requirements. Now, another thing with these is you may choose, I don't want to open it for seating in-house. That's just not going to work. So I'm going to move to a takeout model or a contactless pickup model only. That means they don't have to use vaccine passes, but they're still complying with their requirements because they've made that choice to offer a different service.
Yep.
If now their staff can't turn up, or the customers don't turn up in a CBD because they're working from home, or the customers are having to self-isolate, they've actually met their requirements, even though they've chosen not to use vaccine passes. So again, potentially that business is eligible.
Okay, so somebody who hasn't applied the vaccine passes can still be eligible for this, because that's
Correct.
a key point.
Yeah, as long as they are complying with not using vaccine passes.
Yeah.
So whatever the rules are around that, as long as you're sticking to those rules and you still have a revenue drop because of COVID, not just because you've necessarily chosen a different business model, but because now customers are still not turning up. These are all practical, reasonable steps to minimize your loss of revenue.
Yeah.
And you're
Okay, but let's
complying.
just clarify
Yeah.
one that isn't, as I understand it, practical
Yep.
and reasonable. People can't close to make sure they have a lower amount of money.
Correct. That's right. So you could take the example then of a restaurant who has decided that they are not going to follow those requirements. I'm going to have 200 people turning up into my restaurant, no masks, no separation, standing service. We've got a band going. They're out.
Yeah.
They are not complying with the requirements under the current framework.
Okay.
Or because a business, let's say maybe a taxi driver, has decided it's not safe for me, so I'm not going to operate. Whereas under the current settings, they are allowed to operate.
Yeah.
So if they make a conscious choice to close or not operate their taxi, then they are not eligible.
Okay, because that's their choice to do that. So
Correct.
just looking at it, when we look at that first comparison period in those first 6 weeks in 2022, that's available as of yesterday. So the people
Correct.
those 30,000 people or businesses that have already applied are applying to that comparison period. Because one of the big changes, obviously some people, and I think this was the feedback that you got from probably many chambers and also many businesses around the country was, well, it's hard to be 40% down when we're already down. And so the additional now comparison period is the same dates, but from 2021. Is that correct?
So that's what's been announced by the Minister
Yep.
of Finance. Now there is, as I mentioned before, a process that needs to go through. I think he made the announcement mid last week. Days are starting to tumble on top of each other at the moment, but I think it was last Wednesday he may have made that announcement. So yes, he has announced another comparative period. That has to go to his cabinet colleagues to agree to, just like all these other public health decisions need to go through cabinet to get to their point. Then there needs to be a legislative process, and then applicants will be able to use that comparative period. We expect that won't be until at least Thursday next week.
Okay. So if your business is significantly down in 2022, but it's not significantly down in the last 7 or 8 days compared to the first 6 weeks of 2022, i.e., it's not got dropped by Omicron just yet, but it is significantly down and over 40% down against the previous year, you'll be able to claim, just not until those
just not yet. Yeah, just not
okay.
yet, and they will be able to apply for the first payment because, as I said, the applications are going to be open for quite a period of time, so they're not going to miss out on payment one. They just shouldn't apply just yet because the declarations are that it's actually 2022 that you're comparing to, not 2021.
And in terms of what they can claim, so every business can basically, if they're eligible, claim $4,000 as a fortnightly payment, plus $400 per full-time equivalent person who's working there. And I think the maximum is 50 people. So no matter how big the business is, if it had 250 members of staff, it could still only claim for those first 50 employees. And that would be a maximum for a big business or a medium to big business of 24,000. And for a smaller business, as you say, that's got a couple of employees, then we're talking about 4,800 or somewhere around there.
That's right. Yeah, in that vicinity. There is, if a business is very low revenue, for example, it might be just a part-time business, then their amount of their payment is limited to 8 times their revenue drop, or $4,000, whichever. 8 times their revenue drop.
Okay, and so what's the point at which a business is very small? So is it up to 500,000 revenue or up to 100,000 revenue?
No, it's way lower than that. It's under $1,000 a week. It's it is very much your part-time Uber driver, for example.
Right. So if they're turning over 50 grand, then they'll be classed as very small. But if they're turning over more than that, if they're turning over, as you say, more than 1,000 a week, then they wouldn't fall into that criteria.
Correct. That's right. Yeah.
Okay, great. Great. So I think that'll be a really good clarification for quite a lot of both our members and then the wider business community out there.
The vast majority of applicants get at least $4,400. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And that's each 2 weeks, and that's for a period of 6 weeks in total. So 3 payments. But as the government have said, there is the possibility that that may get extended depending upon what happens in this Omicron wave.
Sure. Yeah. And I was going to say, it's gone.
No worries.
Separate applications have to be made for each payment. So it's not just apply for one and you get all 3.
Gotcha. Okay, so we do have to keep making those applications and also be able to show that 40% drop. But as you said, they'll clarify those periods so that we understand just what they are.
Yeah, we will update our website, so watch out for that. Probably Wednesday, Thursday next week, I'd say we'll be updating that information. Just one point I'll maybe just add about comparative periods. There is the concept of highly seasonal businesses. They are allowed to choose a different comparative period if they are a highly seasonal business. We're not talking necessarily about a business that just has a few ups and downs, but generally is earning income across a 12-month period. It is really those that are very seasonal. I think maybe for Marlborough in particular, it could be, there will be some crops due to be picked right now. If your entire workforce is sick or having to self-isolate because they're close contacts and you aren't able to pick the crop and therefore lose revenue, you can't really compare yourself to January, February because that's not your income earning period necessarily. So you can look to like March last year, for example, because that's what I would have earned. From 1 March 2021, I would have earned $200,000 from this crop. I now don't have it, but remember, it's got to be because of COVID, not because of a weather event or something like that. It's again coming back to the circumstance about why the income can't be earned or is stopped.
But also accommodation businesses would potentially fall into that highly seasonal situation.
So look, I'm not entirely sure that that's the case. I mean, I've had discussions with our lawyers internally. They would ask, and certainly I would ask yourself 3 questions. What is the nature of your business? When do you earn income? And this comes down to, is it spread through the year with some peaks and some troughs? And how is the income earned? Consider those 3 questions and then potentially seek some advice around whether that business is highly seasonal or it's just the nature of the business that it just does fluctuate. I mean, I can think, if we wanted, say, to go to an accommodation example, one that would spring to mind would be a ski lodge that 95% of their revenue is going to be earned during the ski season, and they might get 5% spread across because people just want to come to a mountain and stay, maybe if the place is open. So that's kind of, for us, that's what we consider highly seasonal in the accommodation business. Other people may have different views. So I would certainly encourage a business like that to, one, answer those three questions, and then secondly, maybe to seek some advice before making an application. And that could be coming to us. We'd prefer you detail that in a web message to us rather than trying to pick up the phone, because I suspect the person who answers the phone.
There's no clear guidelines on it quite yet. It's a case of talk to your accountant and answer those questions, and then go from there.
I mean, our view is it's got to be highly seasonal, not just seasonal, where there's a few dips and a few peaks. Highly seasonal, and we would go back to looking at horticulture or agriculture sectors who have obvious seasons, destinations where there is an obvious tourist season versus not having an obvious one.
Okay, and I guess, I mean, as a region, we've got 280, 300 million normally tourism dollars going through this region. So there'll be some pretty seasonal businesses out there, but they need to ask themselves those questions to get to the answer realistically.
Absolutely correct.
Okay,
correct.
And so to just look at the type of businesses who can apply, what about sole traders? The scheme's open to them in the same way?
Absolutely. Sole traders' maximum payment will be $4,400 if they don't have employees as well. So the scheme's open to them. So think about your electrician, or if they get sick and are unable to offer a service, then.
And what about charities and not-for-profits? Because even though they're not-for-profits, they're still trying to generate revenue.
Correct. Yeah, they still generate revenue. So churches, if they have revenue-generating activities, op shops, maybe down the main streets, those type of organisations, they generate revenue, and if they can, show a reduction in revenue, then they certainly are entitled to apply. If they don't have any employees, they don't need to add any. I think in RSP we did ask them to add one. That they don't do that anymore. They just apply for the organisation if they are fully staffed by volunteers.
And what about somebody who's just bought a business? How are they affected by this?
So recently acquired businesses may be able to qualify. Again, the business needs to have been in operation for at least a month. So that is the previous owners as well. So as long as it's been in business for a month, then a recently acquired business can apply. If appropriate, they can use the previous owner's revenue that was earned during the comparative period. But it could be potentially that even though they may have owned it for less than a month, there's somewhere in the comparative period where the new owner started earning some revenue for the business. So have a look at the website. It's got recently acquired business page specifically covered. We can't help businesses get information from previous owners. So hopefully that's all been done as part of the due diligence of purchasing the business or taking it over. The other thing around that is if it's recently acquired is that it needs to be the same sort of business. So if it was a cafe, it needs to continue being a cafe. In terms of brand new business, it needs to have been around for a month.
Okay.
So if it was just something somebody's decided to set up, and if they unfortunately chose the 17th of February to start their business, then they're not going to be eligible because there's no.
And there is also a pre-revenue
situation. Pre-revenue. That's correct. So this is where we've talked about revenue a lot. This all applies to capital raising ability as well. So where a business was in the process of raising capital, and this is not, say, the owner's own money, this is capital that's being provided through funding sources. If that is impacted by what is happening now, then they could well be eligible as well, even though they haven't commenced trading.
Right. Okay. I think we've covered a hell of a lot there, Keith, in 24 minutes. So just to sum up, what people need to do now is they need to judge those first questions and criteria that you talked about, all of which are on the IRD website. The other thing they need to get is a New Zealand business number if they haven't already got one. That's one of the details they'll need, and they'll need their bank account. They'll need the names and details of their staff to make the application. But in terms of getting on the website, It's as simple as Googling IRD and COVID support payment. It'll take you straight there, and it's pretty self-explanatory once you get to the website.
Yeah, there is a lot of information there, so I will warn people. But a lot of it is trying to cover off the circumstances we've described. So the specific pages around recently acquired business. We haven't talked about commonly owned groups, for example, which is where a number of businesses are owned by the same people. So there's some rules around that for people. So have a read of that page, because there will be some, particularly events or hospitality-based organisations where that is their business model, that they do operate a number of different businesses. I mean, we've got one in Wellington here that has 60 different venues, all owned by the same
then
people.
Would they need to be able to show it across the entire group that there was over 40%? So they can't say this venue's 70% down and this one's 2% down. They've got to show it across their entire business.
Yeah, they do two things. One, calculate it across the entire business, and then each one individually who has reached the 40% threshold is allowed to apply. Any that didn't make the 40% can't apply.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does.
So there's a whole page on that. So yes, it will look like there's a lot of information. For most businesses, the landing page, the eligibility page, and the how to apply page should give you enough information to get through.
Great. And I guess the last thing for me to say, Keith, is thanks very much. I mean, these are meant to be short and pretty sharp. Just get through and get as much information as we can. Obviously, a lot of people will watch this later in the day or tomorrow or the rest of the week. But the key is, if anybody's got any questions, I'm more than happy to talk them through that and try and answer those questions. And really appreciate your time today, because I know it's a busy time for you guys, but we really do appreciate this. So thanks very much.
You're more than welcome. And good luck to everybody on the call.
Thanks very much. Take care, Keith.
Thank you. Take care.
See ya.
Bye.